The cries ripped through the Alaskan quiet of Sitka Sound in 1802, signaling an end to peace. Ambrosium Platnikov, a Russian laborer, saw a vision of impending doom. Some 60 Tlingit war canoes cutting through the water, warriors with eyes blackened like the abyss, heading straight for the St. Michael the Archangel settlement. This was more than an assault. It was a brutal reckoning for those who had come to steal land, resources, and trade with their enemies. Survival now hung by a thread. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 27th of June, 1802, Ambrosium Platnikov, a young Russian laborer, was returning from checking on cattle grazing near an inlet of Sitka Bay. The normalcy of his task was shattered by a series of loud, blood-curdling screams. He reacted instantly, rushing back over the ridge that separated the stream from Sitka Bay. The sight that greeted him was undeniably horrifying. Roughly 60 Tlingit war canoes were rounding the point of the bay, heading directly for the Russian settlement of St. Michael the Archangel. These were not crude vessels, but spruce war canoes, their sides carved with ornate designs. Each carried dozens of Tlingit warriors, clad in bear and wolf skins, their faces painted black around the eyes. They presented a fierce, almost ghastly appearance, even under the midday sun. Their armament was formidable and varied. Spears, bows, and arrows, and a considerable number of firearms. Many of these firearms had been acquired, directly or indirectly, through trade with Russian merchants, an irony that would soon prove fatal. The objectives of this raid were multifaceted. The Tlingit warriors aimed to take captives, who could then be ransomed or enslaved. They sought to plunder supplies and weapons from the Russian settlement. But beyond these material goals, the raid was intended to deliver a larger, brutal message to the intruders from the West. These Russians had come to trade with Tlingit enemies, to steal their land, and to deplete their streams. The warriors intended to send a message so violent that it would be carried back to the chief of these foreigners, compelling him to halt his subjects' incursions into lands that were not theirs. Platnikov himself was a poor Russian peasant, in many ways as much a victim of Russian imperialism as those whose territory he now found himself upon. He was a day laborer, likely having fled a desperate situation in his homeland or been pressed into service for an expeditionary party due to his low social status. He possessed no influence on geopolitical policy, nor could he hope to single-handedly combat several dozen canoes filled with determined Tlingit warriors. His first instinct was for self-preservation and the communal safety of his fellow workers. He made a dash for the shared living quarters, but his frustration mounted as he found it locked and empty. With no time to investigate the whereabouts of the other settlers, Platnikov sprinted towards the stables. He kept a loaded rifle there for precisely such emergencies. As he reached the stables, Tlingit warriors began to swarm the village. Their animal head-shaped helmets, crafted to resemble wolves, ravens, and Kodiak bears, created the illusion of a whirlwind of predators rushing through the camp, intent on exacting revenge on the unrepentant intruders. Inside the stables, Platnikov grabbed his weapon. He moved as stealthily as possible, attempting to fortify positions under the windows, trying to construct some form of ad hoc defensive position. While moving to the furthest, darkest corner of the stables, he was startled to discover a mother and child hiding in the shadows. They were, understandably, terrified. The young mother was frozen in fear. Platnikov, assessing the grim tactical situation, knew the stables offered little hope against a determined assault. He told the woman to flee into the nearby woods and hide, assuring her that he would remain in the stables to cover her retreat. The woman and child did as he suggested, disappearing into the comparative darkness and concealment of the thick boreal forest that surrounded the settlement on 3 sides. It was not long before the Tlingit warriors, having made their way through the settlement, turned their attention to the stables. 4 warriors approached, demanding that the door be opened. When their commands were met with silence, they simply bashed the door in. They seized Platnikov by his heavy coat and took his rifle. However, as the warriors struggled to subdue the Russian, he managed to slip out of his coat and make a mad dash for the woods. His pursuers quickly abandoned their chase. The bounty of supplies within the stables was far more enticing than one additional dead Russian. As the raid continued to unfold, the warriors ransacked the stables, taking great glee in the plunder of its contents. After hiding in the shadows of the woods for a few hours, Platnikov was incessantly tormented by the screams of his dying countrymen, mingled with the exhortations of the Tlingit raiders. Unable to remain still any longer, he cautiously made his way back towards the fort, scurrying from the cover of one tree to the next. He soon laid eyes on the end stages of the sudden horror that had been wrought upon the small contingent of Russians. His later description of the events painted a grim picture. I returned to a point near the fort and found all the buildings on fire except the warehouse, of which the Indians had possession, and from which they were throwing furs, provisions, etc., out through the windows and carrying them to the canoes which had been brought for the purpose of taking them away. The scene was one of utter devastation. He witnessed further horrors. I saw one of our men jump through a window of one of the burning buildings, only to be picked up on the fighting knives of the savages and thrown back into the fire. I also saw them cut off another man's head and throw the headless body into the flames. The brutality was calculated and complete. Unfortunately for Platnikov, before he could fully digest the totality of the scene before him, he was spotted by two Tlingit warriors. They gave chase, initiating what must have been a truly terrifying pursuit for the lone Russian. Again, Platnikov managed to hide in the forest, this time for a nerve-rattling few hours, before making a second attempt to survey the ruins of the settlement. By this time, the screams had abated. The scene that greeted the young explorer was one of a macabre, hellish nightmare, except in this case, it was all too real. The buildings were all still on fire, and the ground was now littered with the bodies of his comrades. As he scanned the periphery of the devastation, Platnikov noticed that some of the cattle he had been watering earlier that very afternoon were now milling about outside the settlement. Many of the unfortunate bovines had Tlingit knives embedded deep in various spots about their bodies, a testament to the indiscriminate nature of the raiders' violence, or perhaps a means of securing future provisions. He now attempted to make his way to the animals, perhaps in the hope of at least providing them with some relief from their wounds or ending their suffering. However, he was again spotted and again pursued into the woods, this time by the remnants of the Tlingit raiding party, who still lingered in the area. The immediate area of the settlement was clearly still under Tlingit control. After his narrowest escape yet, Platnikov took shelter under a large tree. He spent a shiftless, terrifying night alone in the Alaskan dark, trying to keep his breathing quiet, listening intently for the footfalls of more Tlingit warriors. The forest, usually a source of sustenance and material, now felt like a closing vice, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig a potential death knell. He had witnessed the ferocity of the attack and the subsequent brutalization of his countrymen. Sleep was an impossibility, replaced by a hyper-vigilance born of sheer terror and the will to survive. The hours crawled by, marked only by the changing patterns of moonlight filtering through the dense canopy and the relentless chorus of his own anxieties. The next morning, he was startled awake by the roar of a group of muskets firing again. The sound was close, too close. He fled, this time further up the mountain, scrambling over rocks and through dense undergrowth, the echoes of the gunshots propelling him onward. On his ascent, driven by the renewed threat, he discovered 3 other survivors, another young mother, her child, and an old man who had managed to escape despite being quite ill. The small group, bound by their shared trauma and precarious situation, represented a sliver of hope in the overwhelming despair. The presence of others, particularly a child and an ailing elder, added a new dimension to Platnikov's struggle. His survival was now intertwined with theirs. This group managed to stay together. hidden from sight, for 8 straight days and nights. Their existence became a primitive cycle of finding meager sustenance, maintaining silence, and evading any sign of Tlingit presence. The forest provided minimal cover and even less comfort. Each rustle of leaves, each distant sound sent fresh waves of fear through their small party. The child's cries had to be stifled, the old man's coughs muffled. Plotnikov, being the most able-bodied, took on the primary responsibility for scouting and foraging, his earlier experiences with the terrain now proving invaluable. Each day during this ordeal, Plotnikov ventured down towards the ruins of the St. Michael's settlement. He clung to the fervent hope of finding some kind of relief effort sent by concerned parties in the capital of Kodiak. Russian officials, he reasoned, would eventually become concerned at the lack of goods and correspondence coming out of this more easterly settlement. These daily descents were fraught with peril, requiring him to move with extreme caution, using every rock and tree for cover as he scanned the bay and the surrounding area for any sign of rescue or lingering threat. After several such days, his vigilance was finally rewarded. He spotted a ship in the distance, making its way towards the site of the settlement. A wave of mixed panic and joy washed over Plotnikov. He dashed out of the dense forest and onto the rocky strip of beach that stretched out into the bay, his arms outstretched, waving frantically in an effort to hail this presumed rescue boat. But his relief was short-lived. Again, Plotnikov was spotted by several Tlingit who had remained in the area. He was compelled to once again escape into the forest, the sight of potential salvation snatched away at the last moment. The Tlingit warriors, perhaps guarding the looted site or watching for stragglers, remained a persistent danger. Plotnikov hid until dark. Then, under the cover of night, he managed to take a more circuitous route to the beach nearest where the large ship had anchored. This time, his caution paid off. He was able to alert the men in the ship's boats to what had taken place at the settlement, his words tumbling out in a torrent of exhaustion, fear, and relief. To his surprise, the ship was actually a British vessel. It had made its way from England, then to Boston, then down around South America, and finally up the Pacific coastline in pursuit of beaver and otter furs. The presence of a British ship, rather than a Russian one, was unexpected, but at this point, any civilized vessel represented sanctuary. Regardless of its flag, Plotnikov was exceedingly grateful for their rescue of him and his brethren from what they had all presumed to be certain death. He returned to his hidden party in the forest, accompanied by a small guard of English sailors. There, he found that in his absence, another survivor had managed to find the mother, child, and old man. This man, a fellow workman named Buren, was taken with the rest of the party to the relative safety of the British ship. The weary group of Russians, their numbers tragically diminished, finally had a reprieve from the constant fear and privation of the preceding days. The next day, Plotnikov and Buren, driven by a need to account for their fallen comrades and observe their religious duties, implored the British captain to allow them to make a trip back into the devastated settlement. Their purpose was twofold: to assess the full extent of the damage and to provide their dead with a proper Orthodox funeral. The captain, perhaps moved by their plight or seeing no harm in the request, granted their wish, again sending a small contingent of armed guards to accompany them for protection. When they reached the ruins of the settlement, the full scope of the death and damage wrought by the Tlingit warriors became sickeningly clear. The headless bodies of men they had lived and worked with, men with whom they had crossed oceans and braved dangers, men with whom they had celebrated Christmases and feast days, now lay strewn about the ground like so much refuse. The air hung heavy with the stench of burnt wood, decaying flesh, and despair. The devoutly Orthodox Russian contingent gave their comrades as dignified a burial and funeral as could be managed under the horrific circumstances. Prayers were said, makeshift crosses perhaps erected, as they committed the bodies to the unforgiving Alaskan soil. And then, their grim task completed, the men made their way back to the British ship that sat waiting in the bay. The British ship remained anchored in the harbor for an additional 3 days. The crew made preparations to travel back to Kodiak, assuming no more survivors would be found. The vigil was a prudent measure, allowing for the possibility that other Russians might have escaped the initial onslaught and were still hiding in the vast wilderness. On the 3rd day, however, a group of Tlingit canoes, seeming to have simply appeared from the ether in their characteristic stealth, suddenly paddled up next to the ship. They approached with an air of confidence, assuming they were dealing with a British vessel whose crew were solely interested in trading for furs, not in colonization or evangelization, which were the hallmarks of Russian presence. The Tlingit chief, in a cryptic attempt to ascertain if the British had been informed as to what had happened at the nearby settlement, asked if they had seen any Russians. The British captain, displaying considerable astuteness, simply lied and said that they had not. He then, maintaining the facade of a simple trader, invited the chief on board to trade. The chief and his cohort, which included his wife, joyfully climbed on board the English vessel, evidently excited for what they presumed would be a profitable endeavor. The prospect of acquiring European goods was a powerful lure. But as soon as their feet touched down on the ship's deck, the entire Tlingit party were all summarily placed in irons. The swift, decisive action took the Tlingit completely by surprise. The deck of the trading vessel instantly transformed into a scene of capture. The remainder of the Tlingit, still in their canoes in the water, were informed that their chief would not be returned until all Russian captives taken during the raid were freed. Furthermore, the Tlingit were informed that if they did not comply with this demand, their chief would be hung from the yardarm of the ship. The British captain had turned the tables, using the Tlingits' own tactics of hostage-taking against them. At the same time that this tense scene was unfolding aboard the first British vessel, 2 more British ships now pulled into the bay. Their unexpected arrival significantly shifted the balance of power. The 3 captains of all 3 vessels now joined forces, resolutely demanding the return of all Russian hostages. The sight of 3 armed European ships presented a formidable threat that the Tlingit could not easily ignore. In response, dozens more Tlingit war canoes appeared, emerging from the hidden coves and inlets around the bay. It was a defiant display, meant to show that they too meant business should any harm be done to their chief and kinsman. The waters of Sitka Sound, so recently the scene of a Russian tragedy, now simmered with the potential for a much larger conflict. However, despite their show of force, the Tlingit were unwilling to see their chief dead at the hands of British sailors. The threat of hanging was a powerful motivator. The Tlingit finally brought forth 2 women and 4 children, presenting them to the British. They insisted that these were all the captives that they had. But the British captains, likely having heard the accounts from Platnikoff and Buren about the scale of the settlement, all concurred that the Tlingit were lying. The number of captives seemed too small given the size of the original Russian party at St. Michael the Archangel. And so the British officers, believing they were being deceived and determined to recover all survivors, ordered their crews to open fire upon the Tlingit canoes. In one riotous 3-ship volley, the cannons and muskets of the British vessels unleashed a devastating barrage. Hundreds of Tlingit now fell dead or wounded. Many wounded warriors fell back into their canoes, while others tumbled into the frothing, frigid waters of the bay. Those left unscathed in the initial blast now found their newly perforated spruce canoes rapidly sinking, the carefully crafted vessels no match for sustained gunfire. Terrified of further reprisal and witnessing the devastating firepower of the 3 ships, the Tlingit on shore now hastily brought forth the remainder of the Russian captives. There was no more negotiation, only a desperate bid to prevent further slaughter. Having delivered the remaining hostages, the Tlingit quickly made their way north, seeking the cover of the inlets and forests from which they had launched their initial attack. With their rescued captives safely on board, the British vessels now set sail for Kodiak. There, their traumatized Russian passengers, including Ambrosium, Platnikoff, and Buren, finally disembarked, carrying with them the horrific memories of the Sitka massacre and the unlikely story of their rescue. The intervention of the British fur traders, motivated by a mixture of opportunism and perhaps a degree of humanitarian concern, had inadvertently played a crucial role in this grim chapter of Alaskan history. Sadly, the individual fates of many survivors of the 1802 attack, including that of Ambrozium Platnikoff, have been largely lost to history. Once they reach the relative safety of Kodiak, their personal stories dissolve into the broader, often impersonal records of the Russian-American Company, or fade entirely from documented accounts. These were, for the most part, ordinary individuals caught in extraordinary and brutal circumstances, their survival a matter of chance and fortitude, but their subsequent lives unrecorded by the pens of chroniclers focused on grander imperial narratives. However, the Russian Empire would not suffer such an affront, the destruction of a settlement and the massacre of its people, without exacting retribution. The loss of St. Michael the Archangel was a blow to Russian prestige and its commercial interests in the region. Plans to exact revenge on the Tlingit were quickly made. The imperial machinery, though distant, began to grind, and the directive for a punitive expedition would soon be issued. The Tlingit victory, however decisive in the short term, had sown the seeds of a future, larger conflict. As for the Tlingit, they were all too keenly aware that they had not seen the last of the Russian intruders. The attack on St. Michael the Archangel was a powerful statement, but they understood it was unlikely to be the final word. They did not take the threat of Russian retaliation lightly. Understanding the nature of their adversary, they began to prepare for the inevitable response. They would go on to construct a fort at the inlet of the river into Sitka Bay. This fortification, known as Shi-Ski-No Sapling Fort, was strategically located to spot and intercept any attacks from Russian ships. Its placement took advantage of the terrain, offering clear lines of sight and a defensible position against a seaborne assault. The Tlingit, skilled in warfare adapted to their environment, were leveraging their local knowledge to prepare for the next encounter. One young Tlingit warrior in particular, named Kalyan, burned for revenge against the Russians. The events of 1802, and perhaps prior grievances, had fueled a deep-seated animosity. He carried a large blacksmith's hammer, reportedly taken from the forge at the St. Michael settlement during the raid. With this formidable improvised weapon in hand, he vowed to one day drench its iron head in Russian blood. This vow was not mere rhetoric. It was a commitment that would shape his actions and his destiny. 2 years later, in 1804, Kalyan had risen to the rank of chief, his prowess and determination recognized by his people. One day, late in the fall of that year, he was alerted to the sighting of Russian ships on the horizon. Alexander Baranov, chief manager of the Russian-American Company, had returned with a formidable force, including the warship Neva. This marked the beginning of one of the most brutal battles in Alaskan history, the 1804 Battle of Sitka. The preparations of both sides were about to be tested. The Battle of Sitka in 1804 would prove to be a pivotal, climactic engagement in the struggle between competing powers for control of the often inhospitable but perpetually invaluable Alaska coastline. The consequences of this continued conflict would shape the region for generations. The 1802 attack and the subsequent 1804 battle reveal the intense clash of cultures and imperial ambitions in early Alaska. These violent events shaped the historical trajectory of the region, leaving a complex legacy. What are your thoughts on these pivotal moments in Alaskan history? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the past.